Welcome everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to be learning about the arms race. What we talk about today is going to help you in class when we meet next time. The arms race was a competition between the United States of America and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. When we talk about arms in this context, we don't mean like the arms on your body. We mean arms like missiles, arms meaning weapons. In this case, nuclear missiles. And the competition between these two countries to get bigger and badder ones. You may recall, at the end of World War II, the United States was the very first country to develop nuclear weapons. But surprisingly, in 1949, well before anyone thought the Russians would have figured it out, Russia developed the atomic bomb for the first time. Now the US is not the only superpower with atomic bomb capabilities, and as you can imagine, this makes the US really afraid. I'm going to show you a YouTube video that shows you just how afraid people were.
President Truman's dramatic announcement that Russia had the atom secret caused state departments all over the world to stir uneasily.
The world.
Will the atom shatter a world to fragments, or will it be a boon to mankind? Will man destroy himself, or use his power to make existence a paradise? 1950 may tell the tale.
So as you can tell by that dramatic music and big explosions and everything like that, people were really worried about Russia having the atomic bomb. So worried that they decided our next president needs to be someone who can take on the Russian threat. The next election was between two men. Adlai Stevenson, the Democrat, he would have been the third Democrat in a row after FDR and Harry Truman, and Dwight David Eisenhower on the right. Eisenhower, hero of World War II, supreme Allied commander, the man who had ordered the invasion of Normandy during D-Day. When Americans were thinking, who do I want leading my country into the 1950s against the new Russian threat in the Cold War, they overwhelmingly chose Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower states in red, Stevenson's states in blue. They had a rematch 4 years later in the 1956 election, and again, overwhelmingly, people chose Dwight D. Eisenhower. And one little vote for Jones down there in Alabama. Americans were very afraid now that the Russians had the bomb. They were afraid of what nuclear war would look like. Everyone knew that war was bad. When the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred, 2,000 American sailors and soldiers were killed. But the thought was that if a nuclear weapon was launched, something far worse than what happened to the folks at Hiroshima and Nagasaki would occur. As these weapons got bigger and stronger, more and more Americans may have been killed. So Americans started thinking, how could we protect ourselves if such an event happened? They started creating what we call fallout shelters. Fallout is the radiation and deadly nuclear dust that occurs as a result of an atomic bomb blast. So if the heat from the blast or the explosion itself didn't kill you, the radiation and the nasty stuff a bomb creates could kill you. And it could live on the surface for weeks, months, or even years. So Americans would build, as we see here, a fallout shelter to protect themselves against that radiation. You can see in here, this one's called the Kitty Cocoon. It can hold a family of 3 to 4 people. You can see the bunk beds. They don't look very comfy, but it'll do in a pinch. Canned food, canned water, a little toy for the girl, a radio, flashlight, medical kit. It wouldn't be very comfy, but hey, you'd be alive. Fallout shelters were built all over the United States at this time. Some old houses built in the 50s, you can still find fallout shelters in the basement. If you look around places like Baltimore and DC, you can still see these signs that say fallout shelter on older buildings. This fear that if an attack occurs and occurs without warning, we want to be ready. An arms race started between the Soviet Union and the United States of America. Neither side wanted the other one to be more powerful, so they started building more and more weapons. They started creating not just atomic bombs, but what we call hydrogen bombs. Hydrogen bombs split hydrogen atoms and are even more powerful and even deadlier than the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. where those bombs could create a blast radius of 2 to 3 miles. A hydrogen bomb could create a blast radius of 20 to 30 miles or even more. And both sides were building not just hundreds, but thousands of these missiles. Missiles that could be dropped from airplanes, missiles that could be shot out of submarines, missiles that could be launched from the ground, missiles that could be launched from the air, to stop the other country from having more. A second race that was starting at this time was called the space race. The Soviets were the first to create a satellite. A satellite is a man-made object that orbits the Earth. The moon is technically a satellite, but man did not make it. When we say satellite, we usually refer to a man-made object that orbits the Earth. And the first one you can see down here, the one with the little legs coming off of it, that's called Sputnik. It was the first man-made satellite, and Sputnik means world traveler in Russian. When the Americans first heard the Russians had the capability of launching a rocket and putting something up into space, they were so afraid. They thought, if they can put that little basketball-looking thing up in space, what if they can put a nuclear missile up in space? The Soviets launched the first living organisms into space, this dog named Laika. Unfortunately, Laika was killed on re-entry due to the heat in the spacecraft. The Americans countered, wanted to do even more. They launched some of the first monkeys into space, like this chimp called Ham. Ham made it back safely, don't worry. And this competition grew, so we're not just competing over who gets the best missiles, we're competing over who has the best rockets, we're competing over who has the strongest astronauts, we're competing over who can put the first man in space, the first woman in space, the first man on the moon. It's all a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two big powers in the Cold War. This obsession with space led to a lot of changes in American culture, a lot of ideas about like what if people could live in space. If you've ever seen the cartoon The Jetsons, it comes out of this time. You can see even in biscuit advertisements, space phones and space guns for kids, even making little hats out of pasta colanders. Everyone was obsessed with space. Nuclear weapons over the Cold War grew and grew and grew. You can see in the 1950s there were only a couple dozen between the two countries. By the end of Eisenhower's presidency, something like 20,000 nuclear weapons possessed by the United States of America. By the end of the 1970s, both countries had near 25,000. Towards the end of the Cold War, it's estimated the United States had less than 30,000, whereas Russia had over 40,000 nuclear weapons. In the modern day, Russia is thought to have a few more nuclear weapons than the United States, but far less for both countries than they had during the Cold War. There are other countries today that also have arms, nuclear weapons: France, China, Britain or the United Kingdom, India and Pakistan. It's thought that Israel has many nuclear weapons. We know North Korea to have nuclear weapons, and probably some guy named Jeff has nuclear weapons too, but who could say? So what you should have gotten from this lesson about the arms race is that the arms race was the development of nuclear weapons and also the competition that existed between the United States of America and the Soviet Union to see who could get the best weapons, the biggest weapons, who could put men into space faster, who could be the best country. Because if you were the best country and the strongest country, you might be the best country to win a war if it ever broke out. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.